I was loading the last of my father's tools into a cardboard box when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. Oregon area code, but not saved in my contacts. I almost sent it to voicemail. I was tired and the house smelled like old motor oil and I hadn't eaten since breakfast. "Is this Martin?" The voice was a woman's. Measured. A little careful. "It is," I said. "This is Judy Reese. I'm the estate attorney your father hired to update his will last year. I'm sorry to bother you on a Saturday, but I need you to come to my office before we proceed with probate, and I'd ask that you come alone. Don't bring your brother." I was standing in my father's garage in Bend, Oregon, holding a crescent wrench that still had grease on the handle. Outside, through the open side door, I could see the November sky sitting flat and gray over the Cascades. Everything was still, and then it wasn't. My name is Martin Calloway. I'm 53 years old. I grew up in Bend and moved away at 22 and came back at 49 when my father's health started declining. My father, Harold Calloway, died 11 weeks before that phone call. He was 79. The doctor said it was a stroke. He had been in reasonable health for his age, active, sharp, still doing his own grocery shopping and his own taxes. The stroke had come on a Tuesday evening in August with no warning anyone could have prepared for, and by Thursday morning, he was gone. My father had been a quiet and deliberate man, a civil engineer who'd worked for the county for 31 years before retiring. He kept paper records of everything. His filing cabinet was alphabetized. His garage was organized by category, by frequency of use, by size. He had been precise about the world in a way that had sometimes felt like coldness when I was young, and that I had come to understand as care when I got older. My brother, Dennis, is 4 years younger than me. He lives 12 minutes from my father's house and had been the one to handle the immediate aftermath of Dad's death. The funeral arrangements, the death certificates, the initial calls to the bank and the insurance company. I had flown in from Albuquerque, where I'd been living for the previous 2 years, and between the two of us, we had managed the first weeks the way families manage these things. Poorly and together. Dennis had been the one to recommend the estate attorney. He'd said a colleague of his had used a firm in Bend for exactly this kind of situation. I hadn't asked many questions. I trusted my brother. I had trusted my brother my entire life. When I got to Judy Reese's office the following Monday morning, she was already waiting in the conference room with 2 folders on the table and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Judy Reese was in her early 60s. Small, precise posture. She had the manner of someone who spent a great deal of time delivering difficult information and had learned to do it without flinching. She thanked me for coming and asked me to sit down. Then she said, "Before we begin the standard probate process, I need to show you something your father left specifically for this meeting. He instructed me not to share it with any other party until I had spoken with you directly and alone." She slid the first folder across the table. Inside was a letter. 2 pages, handwritten on yellow legal pad paper. My father's handwriting. The precise, slightly compressed print of a man who had spent decades writing field notes in the margins of engineering drawings. The letter began, "Martin. If you're reading this, I wasn't fast enough. I'm sorry for that." I put the letter down after the first paragraph. I needed a moment. Judy Reese waited without speaking, which I appreciated more than I could have said. I picked it up again. My father wrote that he had been keeping records for approximately 14 months before he died. He had noticed the first irregularity in March of the year before his death. A distribution from his investment account of $11,400, described in the statement as a portfolio restructuring allocation. He had not authorized it. He had called the firm and been told it was standard practice during a rebalancing cycle, pre-approved under the original advisory agreement. He had asked for a copy of the relevant section of the agreement. He had compared it to his own copy. His copy was missing page 9. My father's financial advisor was a man named Carl Pendleton. Carl had been managing my father's retirement accounts for 9 years. He had been introduced to my father by Dennis. They had played golf together twice. He sent a card every Christmas. I set the letter down a second time, not because I couldn't read it, because I needed to decide whether I was understanding it correctly before I kept going. Judy Reese said quietly, "Take whatever time you need." I kept going. Over the 14 months that followed that first phone call, my father had tracked 9 additional transfers from his accounts, The smallest was $3,200. The largest was $26,000. Each one described in similar language. Each one, my father had concluded, unauthorized. The total he had calculated came to just over $112,000. He had been meticulous about it. He had printed every statement and highlighted every questionable line. He had kept a running log in a small wire-bound notebook he bought from the office supply store on 3rd Street. He had dated every entry. He had noted who he spoke to and what they said. What I did not fully understand yet was why he hadn't told me, or gone to the police, or done anything other than document it. The letter told me on the 4th page. He had started feeling unwell in January, fatigue that he attributed at first to winter, to age, to grief over my mother who had passed 4 years earlier. Then came the headaches. Then the occasional confusion that frightened him enough to see his doctor. A GP named Dr. Hero, James Whitmore, who ran blood work and an MRI, and told him his brain showed early markers consistent with small vessel disease. Not uncommon in men his age. Manageable, the doctor had said. With medication and reduced stress. My father had started a prescription in February. The symptoms didn't improve. In April, he wrote in the notebook, a single line set apart from the other entries, the tea. When did I start drinking the tea? I had to stop again. I remembered the tea. I had been home for Christmas the previous year, 15 months before he died, and there had been a gift basket on the kitchen counter. One of those expensive ones wrapped in dark green cellophane. Loose-leaf teas, honey, a jar of local jam. My father had said it was from Carl, that Carl sent one every year to his clients. I had made a cup of the chamomile that evening. My father had been drinking it every morning since it arrived. The notebook entry 3 days after the tea entry read, called the number on the package. Company's out of Scottsdale. Rep said it's a wellness blend. Told me what's in it. I looked up the ingredients. I don't recognize one of them. Heliotropium. Looking into it. My father had been a civil engineer, not a chemist. But he had known how to research. He had spent his career reading technical documents and flagging what he didn't understand. He had spent 3 weeks reading about heliotropium alkaloids, about pyrrolizidine alkaloids, about the cumulative effects of low-dose exposure over months, about how they could, over time, cause liver stress, neurological symptoms, cognitive changes that presented in older patients in ways that were consistent with ordinary age-related decline. He had saved 2 tins of the tea. He had written in the notebook, I need to have this tested. I need to do this right. If I'm wrong, I have destroyed a man's reputation over a grocery store tea blend. If I'm right, I need proof that will hold up. He had sent a sample to a private lab in Portland. He had paid for it out of his personal checking account, not the joint account, because Dennis was on the joint account and my father had, by that point, begun to suspect that Dennis had told Carl things he shouldn't have known. The test results came back in June, 2 months before my father died. The lab had confirmed the presence of pyrrolizidine alkaloids at concentrations that, with daily consumption over 14 or more months, could produce the exact neurological presentation my father had been experiencing. My father had written, This is not a coincidence. I know what this is, but I don't know how much time I have and I don't know who else to involve. I have to be careful now. He had been careful. He had brought everything to Judy Reese in July, 3 weeks before the stroke that killed him. He had told her to contact me and only me after he was gone. He had left the notebooks, the statements, the lab results, and a flash drive containing photographs of every document in a locked strongbox bolted to the floor of his office closet behind a stack of old survey maps. The combination was my mother's birthday. Judy slid the second folder across the table. Inside was a handwritten index on a single sheet of paper, in my father's print, listing exactly what was in the strongbox and where the strongbox was located. She said, The box is still at the house. He left you the key. She placed a small brass key on top of the folder. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I asked her how long she had known. She said, Since July 14th. I asked why she hadn't gone to the police herself. She said, Your father specifically asked me not to. He wanted you to make that decision. he said, and I'm quoting directly, that you are the one in the family who would know what to do without being reckless about it. I drove back to my father's house. I sat in the driveway for a while before going inside. The strongbox was exactly where the index said it would be. Behind the survey maps in the office closet bolted to the floor, gray steel, dusty. I turned the combination. The latch opened. What was inside was everything my father had described and more. The notebooks, 3 of them, filled in that same precise print. Bank statements going back 2 years, with entries highlighted and cross-referenced by date. A printed copy of the original investment advisory agreement, with a handwritten note on the first page. My copy. Page 9, missing. Carl's copy has page 8A, not in mine. Why? A manila envelope labeled with my name, containing 8 photographs taken on his phone, of documents spread out on his kitchen table. And at the bottom, a typed letter on Carl Pendleton's firm letterhead dated the previous November, which I recognized as a copy of the contract renewal my father had signed. I read through the notebooks in order. The first one was observational, careful, measured. My father in his engineering mode, documenting what he saw without drawing conclusions yet. The second notebook shifted. The tone changed around the entries in March and April, when his symptoms were worsening and he had begun connecting the timeline of his illness to the timeline of the tea. The handwriting in places was slightly less controlled. Not much. My father had extraordinary self-discipline, but enough that I could see him in it. Frightened, working to stay methodical anyway. The third notebook was harder to read. In one entry from May, he wrote, "I have been thinking about why Dennis would do this. I have gone around it many times. I keep coming back to the same answer. He didn't think it through. He's not malicious. He's careless in ways I spent 30 years trying to correct." He told Carl about the accounts, maybe about what was in them, maybe about how I managed money. Maybe he thought it was harmless. I don't know if he understood where that information would go. I don't know if I want to know. 3 pages later, I haven't told Martin because Martin and Dennis are brothers. If I tell Martin and I'm wrong, it breaks something between them that can't be fixed. And if I'm right, that's already broken, and Martin will have to be the one to hold it. I'm asking him to carry this without having chosen to. I'm sorry for that. It's the only way I can think to protect both of them. My father had been protecting me from a grief he knew was coming regardless, because he wanted me to be the one who handled it with his eyes open. I sat at his kitchen table with the notebooks spread out in front of me for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor. I thought about calling Dennis and decided not to. Not yet. I called a lawyer instead, a woman named Frances Aubert, who I'd met through a mutual friend and who practiced civil litigation out of an office in Portland. I told her everything, from the beginning, all of it. She listened without interrupting for almost 40 minutes. When I finished, she said, "I need you to photograph everything in that box tonight and email it to me. Don't move anything. Don't make any calls to the financial firm. Don't talk to your brother yet. Can you do that?" I said yes. She said, "Martin, what your father documented, if it holds up, is serious. The financial piece alone is a significant felony. The other piece..." She paused. "Let's let the right people determine that." I spent 3 hours that evening photographing every page of every document with my phone, the way my father had taught me to document things when I was young. Systematically. In order. Overlapping frames so nothing got missed. Frances moved quickly. Within a week, she had connected with a detective at the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office, a man named Detective Ray Holbrook, who handled white-collar financial crimes. Detective Holbrook reviewed the notebooks and the financial records and arranged for the remaining tea in the tins to be sent to the Oregon State Police Forensic Laboratory in Clackamas. The financial investigation moved faster than the forensic one. Within 3 weeks, Detective Holbrook had served a subpoena on Carl Pendleton's firm and obtained their internal records. What those records showed was a pattern that extended beyond my father. There were 4 other clients, all elderly, all men who had been introduced to Carl through referrals from people they trusted, who had experienced unexplained withdrawals described in similar language over the prior 3 years. My father had not been the first. Carl Pendleton was placed under arrest on a Thursday morning in February. The initial charges were fraud, wire fraud, and theft from a vulnerable adult. The financial crimes alone were enough to hold him. The forensic results came back 6 weeks after that. The tea contained measurable concentrations of pyrrolizidine alkaloids, consistent with intentional adulteration rather than incidental contamination. The lab technician noted in her report that the levels present in the blend, consumed daily over 12 to 18 months, would predictably produce the neurological presentation documented in my father's medical records. His doctor, Dr. Tain Whitmore, reviewed the lab results and provided a written statement confirming that had he known about the tea at the time, he would have considered it a probable contributing factor to my father's symptoms. Whether it had contributed to the stroke that killed him was a question that the medical examiner ultimately said could not be answered with certainty. The stroke had occurred. The underlying vascular condition was real. The exposure had been real. Whether one had caused the other in a way that was provable beyond a reasonable doubt, that was a harder question. The district attorney filed a charge of reckless endangerment. Not homicide. Not manslaughter. Reckless endangerment. My lawyer explained the distinction to me at length. I understood it. I did not feel it. What I could feel, and what I held on to in the weeks that followed, was my father's notebooks. The care of them. The precision, the way he had kept going, entry after entry, when he was frightened and sick and increasingly aware that the person he was building a case against had been vouched for by his own son. The investigation into Dennis was careful and took time. What it found was this. Dennis had told Carl about my father's accounts approximately 2 years before my father died. He had mentioned, in what Dennis described as casual conversation at the golf course, that my father was sitting on a retirement portfolio in the mid-7 figures, and was the kind of man who checked his statements every month, but trusted people he'd been introduced to through family. He said he hadn't thought about what Carl might do with that information. He said he'd assumed Carl was simply looking for a referral opportunity. Whether that was true was something the investigators determined they could not disprove. Dennis was not charged. There was no crime in mentioning that your father had money. There was no crime in making an introduction. The law has specific thresholds, and Dennis had stayed, whether by calculation or by accident, on the legal side of every one of them. I have thought about that a great deal. My brother came to me 3 weeks after Carl's arrest. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had read our father's notebooks, and he told me he hadn't known. He told me he was sorry. He told me he hadn't put it together until the investigation started, and that when he had, it had been like something collapsing inside him that he didn't know how to describe. I believe that he didn't know exactly what Carl would do. I believe he told himself the introduction was harmless, because it was convenient to believe that, and he didn't examine it too carefully. I have known my brother for 49 years. He is not a malicious man. He is someone who has spent his whole life not looking directly at the consequences of the things he does. I don't know what to do with that. I am still figuring that out. Carl Pendleton was convicted on all fraud charges 14 months after his arrest. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The civil recovery process, which Francis pursued in parallel through a separate suit, resulted in a judgment that recovered most of the stolen funds from my father's estate, plus significant damages that were divided among the 5 identified victims. My father's share came back to the estate. I donated a portion of it to the Brain Injury Alliance of Oregon because the neurologist who reviewed his case said the alkaloid exposure had likely accelerated the vascular damage that led to his stroke. It seemed like the right place for it to go. I am still in Bend. I kept my father's house, at least for now. I have been slowly going through his filing cabinet, which is organized and alphabetized and will take me a long time to work through completely. In the back of the bottom drawer, behind a folder labeled Properties/MESC, I found a photograph I hadn't seen in years. My father, my mother Dennis, and me, standing in front of this house the summer we moved in. Dennis is maybe 7 years old. I'm 11. My father is squinting into the sun with one hand on my shoulder, and he is grinning in the way he almost never did in photographs, genuinely caught off guard by it. I put the photograph on the kitchen windowsill. My father's letter to me ended with a paragraph I have read many times now. I won't share all of it, because most of it is private. The kind of things a man says to his son when he is not sure how much time he has left and wants to be sure the important things are on record. But there was one part he wrote that I keep coming back to. He said, "I spent a long time being angry at myself for not seeing this sooner." Then I spent a long time being angry at the people who did this. Now I mostly just want you to understand something I learned too late. The people who take advantage of us are almost never strangers. They are the ones we opened the door to, the ones we introduced around. That doesn't mean you stop opening the door. It means you pay attention to who comes through it and what they do once they're inside. My father was a civil engineer for 31 years. He spent his career calculating load-bearing capacities and stress tolerances and failure points in structures that people depended on. He understood in a very precise way that things look solid right up until they don't. He saw the failure coming in his own life before anyone else did. He documented it carefully and hid the documentation where he knew I would eventually look. He did it alone. When he was sick and frightened and watching someone he loved slip past the limits of what he knew how to forgive. He was the most careful man I ever knew. He was also the most quietly brave. I have thought a lot about the order of things. Not fate, not punishment from some higher power. Just the plain logic of cause and effect, the way my father understood it as an engineer. Every structure fails for a reason. Every crack starts somewhere, and if you look carefully enough, you can trace the failure all the way back to the first compromised joint. Carl Pendleton didn't walk into my father's life uninvited. He was brought in, vouched for, handed trust that had been built over decades and transferred in a single afternoon on a golf course. That's how it almost always works. The people who take the most from us rarely break through a locked door. We open it for them ourselves, usually because someone we love is standing right beside us, smiling, saying it's fine. My father understood this by the end. He wrote it down so I would understand it too. What I keep thinking about is the precision it took, not Carl's precision. His was the calculated kind, the kind that serves itself. I mean my father's, a 78-year-old man, alone, getting sicker by the month, sitting at his kitchen table with a highlighter and a legal pad, tracking transfers and cross-referencing contract pages and looking up the chemical properties of compounds he'd never heard of before. He had every reason to stop, to hand it off, to tell someone and let someone else carry it. He kept going anyway, not out of stubbornness, but because he understood that the truth requires a witness, and sometimes you are the only witness available. That's the thing about integrity that doesn't get said enough. It's not a feeling. It's not an instinct. It's a choice you make when you're exhausted and frightened, and the easier option is right there in front of you. My father made that choice over and over, in small increments, in handwritten entries in a wire-bound notebook for 14 months. Nobody saw him do it. Nobody encouraged him. He just kept going because he believed it mattered that the truth be documented carefully, even if he never got to see what came of it. And Dennis? I have had to sit with Dennis for a long time. What he did wasn't malicious. What it was careless in the particular way that people are careless when they don't want to look too hard at the consequences of something convenient. He told himself the introduction was harmless. He probably still tells himself that, on some level, but carelessness at the wrong moment, around the wrong person, with information about someone you love, that has weight. That has consequences that land on other people. That's something I think Dennis will spend a long time understanding, whether he wants to or not. I'm not carrying anger about it anymore. I tried for a while and it was too heavy. What I carry instead is something my father gave me without meaning to. The habit of looking carefully at the people around me, at the documents I sign, at the difference between someone who has earned my trust and someone I've simply decided in advance to trust because it was easier. My father was the most precise man I ever knew. He measured twice and cut once. In everything he did, he applied that same precision to the last fight of his life, the one nobody knew he was fighting. He left me the evidence and trusted me to know what to do with it. I'm still learning how to be worthy of that trust. But I think about him every time I open a door for someone. I think about what he would do. I slow down. I look carefully. And I try to be the kind of man whose word means something. Because I know now what it costs to be the person who documents the truth when no one else will.